Funny thing about ashes. They don't explain themselves. They don't tell you whether it was bad wiring, bad luck, or a lifetime of pressure finally snapping in the dark. They just sit there, gray, quiet, and heavy, like they're waiting for you to figure out what you should have seen coming. I learned that standing on the edge of an empty lot on the south side of Dallas, Texas, where my cotton factory used to breathe, hum, and sweat right alongside me. 2 sons. Only one of them would matter in the end. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to when everything still felt solid, back when the ground hadn't dropped out yet. My name is Harold Whitaker. I'm 71 years old. Born just outside Dallas, raised in a house where summers were brutal, winters were short, and nobody complained because everybody was tired. I grew up believing a man's worth came from what he could build and who he stood by when things got rough. I wasn't flashy, never owned a boat, never cared about golf. If my hands weren't sore at the end of the day, I felt like I hadn't earned my sleep. For 42 years, I ran Whitaker Cotton Processing, a modest factory that cleaned, baled, and shipped raw Texas cotton. No glossy signs, no corporate slogans, just steel beams, grease, and men who showed up before sunrise. We weren't rich, but we were steady. And in Dallas, steady meant you were doing something right. My wife's name was Eleanor Whitaker. Most folks called her Ellie. She had a way of speaking softly that made people listen harder. Brown hair that turned silver early. Eyes that missed nothing, even when she pretended not to notice. Ellie handled the books, not because I couldn't, but because she had a better sense for trouble before it announced itself. She remembered which workers had kids starting school, which ones were too proud to ask for help. She didn't believe in big speeches. She believed in patterns. Ellie used to say, "Harold, people show you who they are when they think you don't need them anymore." At the time, I thought she was just being cautious. I didn't know she was being accurate. We had 2 biological sons. Our firstborn was Richard Whitaker. Richard was sharp, always had been. He went to college, learned business language that turned people into numbers, and married a woman named Janice who believed success should be visible from a distance. Janice wore heels that clicked too loud on my factory floor. She smiled politely but never warmly, asked about margins, liabilities, and what she called long-term exposure. She never once asked about the men working the machines. Richard loved his mother, I'll give him that. But somewhere along the way, he started measuring people by usefulness instead of loyalty. Our second son was Caleb Whitaker. Caleb wasn't mean, he wasn't cruel. He was just absent. Always half somewhere else. Job to job, idea to idea. He showed up late, left early, and promised things he never quite followed through on. He loved us, I think. But love that never shows up when it's inconvenient doesn't do much good. Still, he was my boy. And blood has a way of making excuses for itself. Then there was Evan Carter. Evan wasn't born a Whitaker. We found him one winter night behind St. Mark's Church, not far from downtown Dallas, curled up near the steps, wrapped in a hoodie that wasn't enough for the cold, shoes worn thin, hands red and cracked like he'd been fighting the weather longer than any kid should. Ellie saw him first. She stopped walking like the ground had grabbed her ankles. "He's freezing," she said. No debate, no hesitation. She took off her coat and wrapped it around his shoulders. Evan didn't cry, didn't beg. He just looked up at us like he was waiting to be told whether he existed or not. Ellie squeezed my hand and said, "We're not leaving him here." And that was that. We didn't fill out paperwork the way people do now. We brought him home, gave him food, a bed, a name. Over time, he gave us something back. Quiet respect. Evan didn't talk much, never complained, never asked for more than what was offered. But he watched everything, learned fast, sometimes faster than I expected. He learned the factory floor before he learned algebra, learned when to speak and when not to before he learned confidence. He noticed how Ellie listened more than she talked, how I paid attention to who showed up early. He started calling us Mom and Dad on his own. That wasn't something you forget. Life settled into a rhythm. Richard came by on holidays. Janice critiqued the furniture and hinted about selling the factory someday. Caleb stopped in when he needed something. Evan stayed. He worked summers at the plant, helped Ellie balance the books in the evenings, sat beside me on the porch when the Texas heat finally broke and the cicadas took over the night. He never talked much about where he came from, but he remembered everything about where he landed. As I got older, the world started changing faster than I liked. Cotton prices dipped, then jumped, then dipped again. Banks started calling. Young men in pressed suits told me expansion was the smart move. That borrowing while rates were low was how serious operators stayed competitive. Ellie wasn't sold. She sat at the kitchen table late at night, numbers spread out, glasses low on her nose. "Debt doesn't feel heavy when things are working," she said once. "But it never forgets your name." I listened. I just didn't listen enough. I signed the loans. New equipment, bigger storage, better contracts. On paper it all worked. And for a while it did. Evan left Dallas for a logistics job out of state. Temporary, he said. A chance to learn how supply chains worked beyond Texas. Ellie packed him lunches like he was still a boy. "Just for a bit," he said. "I'll be back." I believed him, because he always came back. The night the factory burned, Ellie and I were finishing dinner. The phone rang, then rang again, then again. By the third call, I could already smell it. That sharp, bitter smell that doesn't belong anywhere near cotton. Ellie stood up slowly. "Harold," she said, her voice tight, "that's not right." By the time we got there, flames were tearing through 40 years of work. Cotton doesn't burn clean. It screams. It collapses inward like it knows it's dying. The fire chief said it was a short circuit. Bad luck. That's what they call it when nobody wants to blame anything specific. By morning, the factory was gone. By the end of the week, the bank wanted answers. And by the end of that month, one son stopped answering my calls. Another started asking questions that didn't sound like concern. There's a moment after a disaster when the noise stops. No sirens. No shouting. No flames. Just paperwork. That's when reality shows up. The factory fire didn't ruin me that first night. The weeks after did. By sunrise, the lot where Whitaker Cotton Processing stood looked like a grave that hadn't been filled yet. Blackened beams poking out of ash. Twisted metal still warm enough to sting your skin. The fire chief told me it was a short circuit. "Nothing you could have done," he said. That phrase sounds comforting until you realize it also means nobody fixing it for you. Ellie stood beside me the whole time. She didn't cry. She just stared like she was memorizing the damage. I should have been doing the same. Because the bank already had. Within days, the calls started. Not the kind where people ask how you're holding up. The kind where they ask when you plan to make things right. Loan officers don't raise their voices. They don't need to. They speak calmly while explaining how fast everything you own can disappear. I sat at the kitchen table night after night, paperwork stacked higher than dinner plates. Ellie poured coffee and watched me read. Finally, she said, "You need to talk to the boys." I nodded. Of course I would. They were my sons. I called Richard first. He answered on the third ring. "Dad," he said, "I heard about the fire." His voice sounded professional, like he was discussing a market downturn, not 40 years of work going up in smoke. "I need help," I said. I didn't dress it up, didn't soften it. "Just temporarily. The bank's tightening. Insurance is dragging their feet." There was a pause. Then he sighed. "Dad, I've talked this over with Janice. That told me everything I needed to know. Given the circumstances," he continued, "this isn't something we can get involved in." I gripped the phone harder. "Richard," I said, "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for time." Janice's voice came through faintly in the background, not whispering, advising. Richard cleared his throat. "Look, from a business standpoint, throwing money at a failed operation isn't smart. You always told me not to sink good money after bad." I swallowed. "This isn't business," I said. "This is family." Another pause. Then he said it. "We can't jeopardize our future for sentimental reasons." Sentimental. That's what he called 42 years. I thanked him, because I was raised to be polite. Then I hung up. Ellie didn't ask how it went. She already knew. I called Caleb next. It went to voicemail. I left a message. Then another. Then a third. 3 days later, he sent a text. "Dad, things are complicated right now. I don't have anything extra." Nothing extra. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Ellie finally said, "That's your answer." That week, the bank called in the first loan. Then the second. Insurance found delays. Suppliers stopped answering emails. Workers came by the house, grown men I'd known for decades, asking what was going to happen. I didn't have answers. I hated that more than anything. Selling things starts small. You tell yourself it's temporary. First went the spare equipment. Then unused land. Then the truck I'd driven for 12 years. Ellie watched from the porch as they towed it away. She reached for my hand. "We still have each other," she said. I nodded, but I was starting to understand something she'd said years ago. Debt never forgets your name. When the house became a possibility, I didn't tell her right away. But she figured it out anyway. She always did. She found the listing papers folded in my desk drawer. Didn't yell. Didn't cry. She just sat down slowly. "That porch," she said quietly, "that's where Evan used to sit with you." That name hit me harder than I expected. Evan Carter was still out of state, still unaware. I hadn't told him. I didn't want him carrying this weight. Not yet. The day we signed the papers, Ellie wore the same dress she'd worn to church for years. The agent kept talking about downsizing opportunities. Ellie smiled politely. Then we walked out of the only home we'd ever shared. I locked the door. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know where I belonged. We moved into a small rental on the edge of Dallas. 1 bedroom, thin walls, no porch. Ellie started coughing not long after. At first, she said it was allergies. Then fatigue. Then pain she tried to hide. Doctors used words like stress and inflammation before they started using quieter voices. I sat beside her hospital bed and felt useless. All those years building something, and this was what I had left to protect her with. That's when Evan called. I almost didn't answer. He could always tell when something was off. "Dad," he said, "you sound tired." I didn't lie. I told him everything. The fire, the loans, the house, the boys. He didn't interrupt. Didn't curse. Didn't ask questions right away. When I finished, there was silence on the line. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Who owns the land now?" I frowned. Why does that matter? Another pause. It just does, he said. I'll be there soon. Evan arrived 3 days later. He didn't recognize the rental at first. He stood in the doorway too long, scanning the room like he was mapping damage. Ellie smiled when she saw him. That tired smile that says, "I'm glad you came before it got worse." He hugged her longer than necessary. Then he looked at me. Not angry. Not emotional. Just focused. "You should have told me sooner," he said quietly. I shrugged, didn't want to burden you. His jaw tightened just a little. "You didn't," he said. "You informed me." That phrasing stuck with me. He didn't confront Richard. Didn't call Caleb. Didn't raise his voice. He started asking questions. About dates. About paperwork. About who signed what. He visited the old factory site alone. Met former workers. Listened. Took notes. Sometimes he stared at things too long. Sometimes I wondered what he was thinking. Or planning. One night, Ellie woke up coughing hard enough to scare me. At the hospital, the doctor spoke gently. Chronic condition, advanced time mattered. Evan stood in the hallway while I signed forms. He didn't look at his phone. Didn't pace. He just stood there, still as a post. Then he said, "I need copies of everything." I asked him why. He looked at me. "Because," he said, "some people mistake kindness for weakness." The next morning, Richard called. First time in weeks. "Dad," he said, "Janice and I have been talking." I closed my eyes. "About what?" "Well," he said, "about what happens next, long term." Something in his tone changed. "You don't have to worry about things anymore," he added. "We can help manage what's left." What's left? Like I was already gone. I told him I'd think about it. Then I hung up. Evan was standing in the doorway. He'd heard enough. "That won't be necessary," he said. That night, Ellie squeezed my hand. "Harold," she whispered, "I think Evan sees things differently than we do." I nodded. "So do I. Because here's the thing. Fire takes everything fast. But betrayal, that teaches you who's worth rebuilding for." And Evan wasn't asking how to help anymore. He was figuring out how to take control. I thought Evan came back to support me. I didn't realize he came back with a plan. One that would make sure the people who walked away never got the chance to do it again. Some people think revenge is loud. They imagine slammed doors, raised voices, courtroom drama. They imagine anger doing the work. But the kind of revenge that lasts, it's quiet. It sounds like questions asked politely. Emails sent late at night. Documents read twice instead of once. That's the kind Evan believed in. And once I understood that, truly understood it, I stopped trying to protect him from what was coming. Evan didn't stay with us in the rental. He got a small place closer to downtown Dallas. Cheap, temporary, no distractions. Every morning he showed up at the hospital early, sat with Ellie, listened to doctors, took notes. Every afternoon he disappeared. He didn't tell me where he went. He didn't need to. Because he wasn't hiding anything. He was building something. The first time I realized Evan wasn't just helping was when he asked me for the original land deed. Not a copy. The original. "Why?" I asked. He shrugged. "Copies lie easier." That sentence stayed with me. He met with lawyers, but not the kind that advertise on billboards. These were quiet offices, no slogans, no smiles. He spoke to accountants who asked more questions than they answered. He tracked the loans, the timelines, the clauses buried 3 pages deep that nobody reads until it's too late. he discovered something I never had time or energy to notice. The fire hadn't just burned the factory. It had exposed everyone who thought I was finished. Meanwhile, Richard was getting comfortable. Too comfortable. He started calling more often, dropping by the hospital, bringing coffee I didn't ask for, talking about options. "I just don't want you stressed," he said once, standing at the foot of Ellie's bed. "At your age, Dad, these things can be overwhelming." Ellie watched him carefully. She didn't speak, but later she whispered to me, "He's already rearranging the furniture in his head." Caleb, on the other hand, vanished. Didn't visit, didn't call. I heard through a friend he'd gotten involved in a real estate scheme that wasn't doing well. Funny how some people only understand consequences when they arrive certified mail. Evan never confronted either of them. That worried me at first. I thought maybe he was avoiding conflict. I was wrong. He was avoiding waste. One afternoon, Evan came back from the old factory site covered in dust. He sat across from me, calm as ever. "Do you know who bought the land?" he asked. I shook my head. "Bank auction, some LLC." He nodded. "Yeah, that's what I thought." That was all he said. But that night I couldn't sleep, because I started noticing patterns. The house we'd sold, taken off the market. The land near the factory. No development signs, no permits pulled. The truck I'd lost, still registered in Dallas, never resold. Things weren't moving. They were waiting. Ellie's health declined slowly, then all at once. She got quieter, tired easier, but her mind stayed sharp. One evening she asked Evan to close the door. She motioned for him to sit. "You're planning something," she said gently. Evan didn't deny it. "I'm fixing something," he replied. She smiled. "That's what your father always tried to do," she said. "Just make sure you don't break yourself in the process." He swallowed. "I won't," he said. "I learned from watching." She reached out and squeezed his hand. That was the last time I saw her smile without effort. After Ellie passed, the house felt hollow, even the rental. Grief does that. It turns noise into echoes. Richard handled the funeral arrangements aggressively. Too aggressively. He argued about costs, about efficiency, about keeping things simple. Janice never cried. She checked her phone during the service. Caleb arrived late and left early. Evan stood beside me the entire time. Didn't say a word. Just stayed. A week later, the letters started arriving. Not to me. To them. Richard called first. "Dad," he said, his voice tight, "did you know anything about a lien on my commercial property?" I paused. "No," I said honestly. "Well, there is," he snapped, "and it doesn't make sense." I pictured Evan sitting at his kitchen table late at night, reading fine print no one else bothered with. "I'm sure it'll sort itself out," I said. He didn't like that answer. Caleb called next. Panicked. "Someone's buying up debt tied to my development project," he said. "It's aggressive. They're not negotiating." I asked him a simple question. "Where were you when your mother was sick?" Silence. "I don't know who you think you're talking to," he finally said. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," I replied. Then I hung up. Evan said nothing, but I noticed he stopped asking questions. That's when I knew the setup was complete. One evening, Evan came by with a single folder. No labels, no tabs. He placed it on the table between us. "I need you to understand something," he said. I waited. "I didn't do this to punish them," he continued. "I did it to protect you." I opened the folder. Inside were documents, Ownership transfers, debt purchases, trust structures. Everything clean, legal, quiet. The house, the land, the truck, all of it, under entities that traced back to him. I looked up slowly. "You bought it all back," I said. "Yes," he replied, "before they could." My chest tightened. "And the boys?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he said, "They thought you were weak because you didn't fight them." I nodded. "They were wrong," he continued. "You just chose the wrong battlefield." The next morning, Richard showed up unannounced. Face pale, hands shaking. Janice waited in the car. "We need to talk," he said. I stepped aside. He sat, and for the first time in his life, he waited, because power had changed hands. Quietly. And Evan. He wasn't in the room. He was somewhere else, making sure the ending was unavoidable. They thought the worst thing that happened to me was losing everything. They were wrong. The worst thing was teaching someone how to take it back. Properly. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just sits across from you, hands folded, waiting for you to realize the conversation has already ended. That's how it felt when Richard Whitaker sat down in my living room that morning. Not angry, not confident, just uncertain. And uncertainty never sat well on him. He cleared his throat. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk about some misunderstandings." Misunderstandings. That word gets used a lot when people realize they're no longer in control. I leaned back in my chair. "You're welcome to talk," I said. "Whether it helps you is another matter." He didn't smile. That worried him. Richard explained slowly, carefully, that several of his properties were suddenly tied up. Loans called, partnerships dissolved, contracts terminated with no warning. "It doesn't make sense," he said. "Someone's consolidating debt quietly, aggressively." I nodded. "I've heard that happens," I said. He leaned forward. "You wouldn't know anything about this, would you?" Before I could answer, the door opened, and Evan Carter walked in. Richard froze. Not because Evan looked threatening, but because Evan looked prepared. "Morning," Evan said politely. Richard stood halfway, then sat back down. "What's he doing here?" Richard asked. Evan didn't answer. He placed a slim folder on the table, pushed it forward. "You should read page 3, he said. Richard flipped through, frowning. Then his face changed. Color drained. "That's not possible," he muttered. Evan tilted his head slightly. "It is," he said, "and it's done." The truth came out in pieces. Evan had bought distressed debt tied to Richard's ventures, legally, quietly, through intermediaries. He hadn't forced failure. He'd simply removed protection. Janice's voice could be heard yelling from the car outside. Richard looked up at me. "You let this happen," he said. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "You did. I just stopped protecting you from it." Caleb called later that afternoon. Not confident. Not angry. Panicked. His real estate deal had collapsed overnight. Investors gone, credit frozen. "I need help," he said. I thought about the messages he never returned, the hospital visits he skipped, the silence. "I already helped," I said. "I raised you." Then I hung up. That night, Evan and I sat on the porch of the small rental. He stared out at the street. "I didn't want it to be this way," he said. I believed him. "But it didn't have to be," I replied. He nodded. Weeks passed. Then something unexpected happened. Construction equipment showed up on the old factory land. Surveyors, engineers, trucks. I thought there'd been a mistake. Evan smiled when I asked. There was, he said, and I fixed it. He rebuilt Whitaker Cotton Processing. Not bigger, not flashier, better. Updated wiring, safer systems, smarter layout. He hired back the old workers first. Men who'd shaken my hand decades earlier. Men who didn't ask questions. They just showed up. The sign went up last. Same name. Same font. Different era. The first day the machines turned on again, I stood on the floor and cried. I didn't care who saw. Cotton moved through the line like it remembered the place. The noise came back. The rhythm. The life. Evan stood beside me. I didn't rebuild it for money, he said. I rebuilt it because this place made you who you are. I couldn't speak. Richard tried calling again. Then writing. Then apologizing. I didn't answer. Some bridges don't need to burn. They just need to stay uncrossed. One evening, Evan handed me a folder. Inside was a deed. The house. The land. The factory. All in my name. I don't need it, he said. I already got what I came back for. I looked at him. What's that? He smiled softly. My family. We buried Ellie beside the church, where Evan and I first met. He stood next to me in the quiet. The wind moved the grass. The world kept going. I thought about everything I'd lost, and everything that somehow returned. People ask me sometimes if I regret trusting my sons. I don't, because regret implies I'd do it differently. And if I had, I might not have learned who truly stayed. The factory runs again. Not forever. Nothing does. But long enough. And that's enough for me. If this story touched you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And don't forget to comment, tell us where you're watching from. Thank you. Have a great day.